Benji stormed through the narrow dirt road leading to his house, the night air heavy with the scent of rain and smoke from distant cooking fires. His mind raced with frustration as the echoes of his friends' laughter faded behind him. They had been teasing him about how strict his mother was, mocking him for not staying out late like the rest of them. Mama's boy, one had jeered, and though he laughed it off at the time, the words stung deeper than he cared to admit. By the time he reached the small house he called home, his anger had bubbled over. The single bulb outside flickered, casting shadows across the yard. Mama Grace was sitting on the porch, her frame wrapped in a faded shawl to guard against the chilly breeze. She had been waiting for him, just as he knew she would. "Benji, where have you been?" she demanded, her voice a mix of relief and irritation. "Do you know what time it is?" Benji rolled his eyes, brushing past her without stopping. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mama. You don't have to wait up for me," he snapped, his tone colder than he intended. Mama Grace stood up, her figure silhouetted against the dim light. "I am your mother, and as long as you live under this roof, you will respect my rules. Staying out this late." "Respect your rules?" Benji interrupted, spinning on his heels to face her. His voice rose, filled with the frustration that had been building for weeks. "You don't control my life, Mama. I'm 22 years old, not some little boy who needs to be told what to do." The air between them grew thick with tension. Mama Grace's face softened for a moment, the hurt flashing in her eyes, but she stood firm. "You may be grown, Benji, but you're still my son. I raised you better than this." Benji scoffed, shaking his head. "Raise me better? All you do is nag and act like I owe you my whole life because of what you did." "I didn't ask for this life, Mama." His words cut deeper than he realized. Mama Grace took a step back, her hand clutching the edge of the shawl. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets. "Benji," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady, "everything I've done has been for you and your siblings. I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to keep you from losing your way." But Benji was too far gone in his anger to hear her. He turned abruptly, shoving the door open with such force that it banged against the wall. "I'm done with this," he muttered under his breath as he disappeared into the small house. Mama Grace stood alone on the porch, staring after him with a heaviness in her chest that no words could ease. The flickering light cast shadows across her tired face, but she refused to cry. Instead, she sat back down, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Inside his room, Benji paced like a restless lion, fists clenching and unclenching. His mother's words echoed in his mind, but they only fueled his frustration. He couldn't understand why she couldn't see that he was no longer a child. He wanted freedom, independence, and respect, but all he felt was trapped. Meanwhile, Mama Grace whispered a silent prayer into the night, hoping that tomorrow would bring a change in her son's heart. Little did she know, the storm brewing within Benji would only grow stronger, threatening to tear apart everything she had worked so hard to hold together. The morning sun filtered through the small, cracked window of the house, casting golden rays onto the wooden floor. The quiet of dawn was broken by the clatter of pots as Mama Grace prepared breakfast in the tiny kitchen. She hummed a tune softly, her mind racing with thoughts of the argument from the night before. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to change. "Benji," she called, her voice firm but steady. "Come out and eat before the food gets cold." There was no response. In his room, Benji lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of their argument still heavy on his chest. The smell of freshly fried mandatsi wafted into his room, but it only reminded him of how angry he still felt. Reluctantly, he pushed himself off the bed, dragging his feet into the main room. As soon as he appeared, Mama Grace's eyes locked onto him. Her face was a mixture of concern and determination. "Sit," she said, motioning to the small wooden table. Benji sat down reluctantly, his arms crossed defensively. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the steaming plate of food in front of him. Mama Grace sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together as if bracing herself for what she was about to say. "Benji," she began, her voice calm but serious. "We need to talk about last night. This can't go on." Benji rolled his eyes, pushing the plate away. "What is there to talk about, Mama? You're always on my case, treating me like I'm still a child." "I treat you like my son," Mama Grace replied firmly, "because that's what you are. But lately, you've been acting like a stranger in this house. Coming home late, disrespecting me, refusing to help with anything. It's not who you are, Benji. You don't know who I am." Benji snapped, his voice rising. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You think you know everything about me, but you don't. You don't understand what it's like to be me, Mama." Mama Grace stood as well, her eyes flashing with both anger and hurt. "What I understand," she said, her voice trembling, "is that I've worked day and night to give you and your siblings a life I never had. I've sacrificed everything for this family, and this is how you repay me? By acting like I'm your enemies." The words hit Benji like a punch to the gut, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I didn't ask for any of that, Mama. I never asked you to sacrifice anything for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Mama Grace's hands trembled as she placed them on the table to steady herself. Her heart ached, not just from the words, but from the realization that her son was slipping further and further away from her. "Benji," she said softly, her voice breaking, "if you can't see how much I love you, then I don't know what else to do." For a brief moment, Benji felt a pang of guilt, but his anger quickly drowned it out. "Maybe you should stop trying so hard," he muttered before turning and storming out of the house. Mama Grace sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. She had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this. She whispered a prayer, her voice shaky but resolute. "God, please help my son find his way back." Outside, Benji walked aimlessly through the village, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. He ignored the curious stares of the villagers who had begun to notice the tension in their home. His anger burned hot, but deep down, a small voice whispered that he was wrong. He shoved it aside, determined to bury his guilt in the noise of the day. But the storm brewing between him and his mother was far from over, and both would soon find themselves tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The sun had barely risen the next day when the tension in the house thickened, like the heavy air before a storm. Benji didn't speak to Mama Grace when he returned home. He went straight to his room, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the old wooden frame. Inside, he threw himself onto the bed, fists clenched and eyes burning with frustration. He couldn't escape the thought of his mother's face, so hurt, so disappointed. But the anger that had been growing inside him for months overshadowed it. He couldn't understand why she wouldn't just let him live his life. Why couldn't she just stop controlling him? He was an adult now. He didn't need her hovering over him, telling him what to do every second. Outside, Mama Grace moved around the yard, trying to keep herself busy, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. She had known that her relationship with Benji had been strained, but this was different. She had never seen him so distant, so full of rage. Her heart ached as she thought about how far they had come, how, when he was younger, he had been her little boy, always by her side. But now she didn't know who he was anymore. She sighed deeply, wiping away a tear before it could fall. It was time to do something about this. She needed to reach him before it was too late. She walked slowly to his door, her hand resting on the frame as she took a deep breath. "Benji," she called softly. "We need to talk. Please come out." There was no response. Benji didn't want to face her, didn't want to listen to another one of her lectures. But something in his gut told him this couldn't go on. He was so tired of fighting, so tired of the constant conflict between them. He stood up, his feet heavy as he crossed the room. He opened the door slowly, but instead of facing his mother, he faced his own reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. The anger in his eyes was undeniable. "Why do I always have to be the one to change?" he muttered to himself, clenching his fists in frustration. Mama Grace was standing there, her face a mixture of determination and sorrow. "Benji, please," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you're angry. I know you don't understand, but I'm trying to protect you. I don't want to lose you." Benji's eyes flashed with fury. "Protect me? You think this is about you protecting me?" He advanced toward her, the storm inside him finally erupting. "I don't need your protection. What I need is freedom. I need to make my own choices, live my own life." He was yelling now, the words pouring out in a rush. The walls of the small house seemed to close in on him as the argument reached its peak. "You've kept me caged my whole life, Mama. I'm not your little boy anymore." Mama Grace flinched at the sharpness of his words. She tried to reach for him, to calm him down, but Benji shoved her away, his eyes wild with anger. The force of the push sent her stumbling back, and she caught herself against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mama Grace's heart was pounding in her chest, and Benji's chest heaved with ragged breaths. He had never felt this out of control before. He took a step back, his anger morphing into something darker. He could feel the weight of the argument, the hurt, the pain in his mother's eyes. And yet, all he could think about was his need to escape, his desperate need to break free. "I'm done, Mama," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm done." With that, he turned and stormed out of the house, his footsteps heavy and sure. Mama Grace stood there, trembling, her hand pressed to her heart. She had never imagined it would come to this. The pain of seeing her son slip further and further away from her was almost unbearable. She sank to her knees, the tears falling freely now as she whispered a prayer for him. Benji didn't look back as he walked down the road, his thoughts racing. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had no choice but to push his mother away, even if it meant losing her forever. Benji didn't return home that night. He wandered through the streets, the cool evening air brushing against his face as his mind raced. He had never felt so lost. Each step he took felt like a step away from the life he knew, the life that had always been controlled by his mother's expectations. But there was something in him that couldn't stop moving forward, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The night stretched on, the sounds of the city humming around him. In the darkness, Benji's thoughts swirled in a mess of anger, frustration, and confusion. He didn't understand why his mother couldn't just let him be. He was a grown man, and yet she still treated him like a child, still tried to control every decision he made. The more he thought about it, the more his blood boiled. He stopped by a bar on the corner of the street, its neon lights flickering in the distance. It wasn't the kind of place he usually went, but tonight he didn't care. He needed something to numb the ache inside him, something to make him forget the rage, the helplessness, the tension that had been building for so long. Benji pushed through the door, and the noise hit him immediately. The low hum of voices, the clinking of glasses, the faint sound of a jukebox playing in the corner. The bartender, a man with tired eyes and a quick smile, nodded at him as he walked in. "Rough night?" the bartender asked as Benji took a seat at the bar. Something like that, Benji muttered, his voice thick with emotion. What can I get you? A bottle of whiskey, Benji said, his voice growing colder. The bartender didn't ask any more questions. He just poured the drink and slid it toward Benji. As the first sip burned down his throat, Benji felt the tension start to ease, but only for a moment. His mind quickly returned to the fight with his mother. He kept seeing her face, the hurt, the confusion, the disappointment. She had always been his protector, his strength, and now it felt like she was the one holding him back. The anger inside him only grew stronger. Benji stayed at the bar for hours, drinking more than he should have. By the time he left, the streets were quieter, and the weight of his thoughts had grown unbearable. He needed to talk to someone, to figure out what was wrong with him. But when he picked up his phone, he saw the dozens of missed calls from his mother. Each one was a stab to his chest, a reminder of the bond they used to share. He finally decided to head home, his steps unsteady but determined. He needed to fix this, or at least try. The door creaked when he opened it, and as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of the house hit him. It was the same smell that had comforted him for years, but tonight, it only made him feel more alone. Mama Grace was sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She had been waiting for him, but when she saw him standing there, her expression changed from worry to something else. Fear, perhaps, or sadness. Benji stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave again, but another part of him knew this was the moment. The moment he either fixed everything or lost it all. "Mama," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond right away, her eyes looking him up and down, as if searching for something, maybe a trace of the son she used to know. "Benji," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "Where have you been? I've been so worried about you." "I needed some space," Benji muttered, his eyes darting around the room. He didn't want to look her in the eye. He couldn't face the disappointment he saw there. "Benji, please," Mama Grace said, standing up now. "We need to talk. I don't know what's going on, but I can't keep living like this. We're falling apart." Benji's anger flared again, and before he could stop himself, the words burst out. "You never gave me a chance to live my own life, Mama. You always tried to control me. And now, it's like everything I do is wrong." Mama Grace recoiled, as if struck by the force of his words. "I never wanted to control you, Benji," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to protect you. I love you." Benji's eyes softened for a brief moment, but the rage still bubbled beneath the surface. He stepped closer to her, the air between them thick with tension. "You don't get it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not your little boy anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Mama Grace didn't know what to say. She had never seen him like this, so angry, so distant. Her heart ached for him, for the son she had lost somewhere along the way. Benji's breath quickened as he took another step forward. His body was tense, ready to break, ready to explode. "I'm done, Mama," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm done with all of this." He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving his mother standing there, her heart shattering as she watched him walk away. The following morning, the silence in the house was suffocating. Benji had barely slept, the weight of the previous night's argument pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that things had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him turn back. He had to prove something, to himself, to his mother, to the world. But when he walked into the living room, he saw her sitting there, waiting. Mama Grace's face was lined with worry, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Benji's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. He had come too far to turn back now. "Benji," she said softly, her voice shaky. "We need to talk." This, this can't go on. He clenched his fists at his sides. There's nothing to talk about, Mama, he snapped, his anger bubbling to the surface again. You never let me make my own choices. Mama Grace stood up, her eyes pleading. You're my son. I love you, but I can't watch you destroy yourself. The words hit Benji like a slap to the face. But instead of backing down, something inside him snapped. He stepped forward, their faces inches apart. You don't understand, he growled. The tension in the room was thick, ready to explode. The silence between them was unbearable. Benji stood just inches away from his mother, his body rigid with rage and confusion. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and panicked, echoing in the heavy air. Mama Grace's eyes were wide, searching his face for the son she once knew, but all she found was a stranger. A young man she didn't recognize, lost, broken, and full of anger. You don't understand, Mama. Benji's voice cracked as the words erupted from him. You ruined my life, controlling everything I do. You never let me grow up. His chest heaved with the force of his emotions. The more he shouted, the more his anger consumed him. But deep inside, a part of him was terrified. Terrified that if he didn't stand his ground now, he would lose himself forever. Mama Grace stepped back, her face pale and trembling. I never wanted to control you, Benji. I only wanted to protect you. Please, I don't want to lose you. The raw pain in her voice cut through him like a knife, but he couldn't stop. The words came faster now, driven by frustration and a need to be free. Protect me? From what? From myself? From living my life? Benji's eyes burned with fury. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mama Grace reached out toward him, her hand trembling. Benji, please. I love you. I don't know how to fix this, but we can try. We can work it out. You don't have to carry this pain alone. For a moment, Benji hesitated. He could feel the weight of her hand, soft and pleading against his hardened heart. But then the darkness inside him surged again, and he violently shoved her away. No, he yelled. I'm done with all of this. He turned, slamming the door behind him as he fled into the night, leaving his mother standing there, broken, watching him disappear into the darkness.